Hello, my name is Allison, and my research issue has to do with ending the school-to-prison pipeline. Let's start with looking at what the school-to-prison pipeline actually is. This is when students, especially students from low-income backgrounds and students of color, are disproportionately forced out of school and introduced to the juvenile justice system. This is when schools adopt a crime control mentality that punishes students like they're adult criminals instead of developing young people. One study looking at national data said that Black students are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience an exclusionary discipline event than white students, usually for subjective, low-level offenses like disruption and defiance. Another study by the U.S. Department of Education said that in 2012, in school districts with more than 50,000 students, African American students represented 24% of enrollment, but 35% of on-campus arrests, with lower but still disparate rates for Hispanic students. Let's take a look at one cause of the school-to-prison pipeline, and this is zero-tolerance policies. This starts when a student misbehaves or commits a minor infraction. Now, this is going to be a behavior that does not pose a safety risk to the school community, but is still a misbehavior, something like talking back to a teacher, tardiness, bringing a prescription medication without a doctor's note, truancy, perceived disobedience, etc. Some of these are perceived misbehaviors, some of them are objective misbehaviors, but nevertheless, the student is given a suspension because of a zero-tolerance policy. This policy is often mandated by the state, or it is a district-wide policy, and it criminalizes behaviors that wouldn't have previously required suspensions or school resource officer intervention. Because of this suspension, the student is going to feel disengaged from the school community. This is because they've missed a couple days of instruction, it's hard to jump back in after being gone, and students can also feel like no one wants them to succeed, no one is rooting for them. This often will lead to the student feeling disengaged and making poor choices, which then will lead to the student misbehaving again, and the cycle starts over again. After a while, these students can also formally be declared delinquent, and they can be placed under court supervision. Let's say that a student is struggling with a behavior like truancy. They're not coming to school. A court can order the student to change their behavior, but it doesn't always provide support that's going to address the root cause of those behaviors. If a student is truant, it could be because their parent is struggling with substance abuse and they don't have structure and support at home to get to school. It could be that they're experiencing something like bullying at school, and that doesn't, they're not given any support to address the causes of those behaviors. So, if they still can't address that behavior after the court order, they can be detained for breaking the court order, and that is going to introduce them to the justice system. One study said that young people who are supervised by the courts have an increased risk of being held in detention, being incarcerated, and recidivism to placement, which means that they're going to offend again and again. So once we have students introduced into that suspension cycle, after a while, they are intercepted by the courts and they're involved in the juvenile justice system. So how do we stop the school-to-prison pipeline? How do we stop this vicious cycle from even starting in the first place? This is truly a complex and deep-seated issue, and there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution, but there are things that we can do to stop this in our own classrooms. One thing is to end suspensions for minor transgressions. One secondary school teacher in a study in the Colorado school system said that whenever we decide a kid is not going to be in school, we actually are violating the one thing we're responsible for. Again, we're not talking about removing suspensions for things like being threatening or making school unsafe for people. We're talking about suspensions that have been given for minor transgressions. We need to stop those. No more in-school, no more out-of-school suspensions for these minor behaviors. We need to keep students in school. Another strategy that we can look to is socio-emotional learning. Socio-emotional learning focuses on behavioral needs of students and can include things like character education, how to recognize and manage your emotions. As growing students, our students need to know how to express their emotions in healthy and positive ways. This also can include how to build positive relationships and how to make good decisions. One study has found that the implementation of socio-emotional learning has been found to decrease school incidents by more than half. It has been found to improve attendance rates and lower out-of-school suspensions district-wide by 60%. So socio-emotional learning works. They can reduce aggression and behavior problems and improve academic performance in all grade levels. One other thing that we need to do as teachers is to examine our implicit bias. We need to check that we have high expectations for all students, including students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. These are the students who are being targeted by these zero-tolerance policies, and we need to make sure that we are holding them up to a high standard and ensuring that they can be successful. One study made sure to emphasize that teacher beliefs impact student outcomes. What we believe about our students, what we believe our students can do, is ultimately going to impact how they feel about themselves, and it's going to continue to influence them even after they leave our classrooms. We can also ask school districts to provide training and color-conscious educational practices. This means that we're going to be aware of the cultural differences between ourselves and our students or differing student groups. The philosophy of colorblindness is only going to exacerbate the problem that is currently there, and it will create a rift in between teachers with little intercultural experience and the students they have in their classes. It dismisses the lived experiences of students of color, and so we need to be color conscious. We need to celebrate our students' cultures and relate with them in that level. We also need to consider the whole student when we are looking at their behavior. Every behavior that we are presented with has a motivation. As teachers, we need to increase our awareness of our students' circumstances. Are their basic needs being met? Is there a trauma in the student's life that is affecting their behavior at school? One study pointed out that youths who reside in high poverty communities are much more likely to encounter these factors like abuse, neglect, food insecurity, homelessness, intimate partner violence, community violence, and poor health outcomes. One of these, and even more so when there's multiple factors present in a child's life, has the potential to elicit a trauma response that looks like acting out at school, but is really rooted in the response to all of these traumas that they are dealing with. Our disciplinary procedures need to be adjusted to account for the potential trauma that our students are walking around and experiencing. We need to discipline students on a case-by-case basis and make sure that the punishment fits the offense. We need to make sure that our punishments are fair and that they are realistic. One culture shift that we can adopt to help break this school to prison pipeline is called restorative practices. The overall goal of restorative practices is for students to understand what they have done wrong, how their actions have affected their community, and what an acceptable behavior would have been instead. Restorative practices work best when that whole school culture is committed, but as teachers, we can also use informal methods in our classrooms. This method takes into account the fact that our students are growing and evolving and learning as people. This helps them grow and build a set of shared values instead of focusing on just avoiding punishment. In our classrooms, when we're using these informal methods, we can encourage students to think about how their actions have affected other people, and we can make sure they understand what an appropriate behavior would have been in the first place. It's all about communication between students and teachers, between the students who are involved in the misbehavior. We need open communication lines for this to work. The three essential components of restorative practices are engagement. Everyone needs to be engaged in those discussions to find a solution. So the student that has committed the offense needs to be involved, students that were victims need to be involved, and the teacher needs to be the moderator in those discussions. We also need explanation. Everyone needs to come to a shared understanding, and the offender needs to understand the consequences of what they've done and how their actions have affected their community and the people in their community. And finally, we need expectation clarity. The student who is the offender needs to understand what is acceptable behavior, and this is going to set them up to be successful in the future. Once they understand those consequences and then they understand what an acceptable behavior would be in the future, they are more likely to make positive choices, and so they don't hurt their community. So, moving forward and approaching our new school year, what is one thing you can do to stop the introduction of students in your school to the juvenile justice system? How can you be involved in stopping the school to prison pipeline? I would also like to challenge you to look at your district's policies. Does your school currently utilize a zero tolerance policy when we're dealing with minor misbehaviors? Here are some references if you would like to do any further reading. Thank you so much for listening and have a great night.